Part 30. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wu Nian. Chapter 291. Tao. Betty's voice was trembling slightly. Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Betty. Betty's baby face was red and she said, "I don't want to be looked at." Chen Tao smiled and said, "Okay." He turned back to look at Hongyu and said, "Hongyu, Haiyu, please keep an eye on me first." Hongyu nodded slightly. A dark cube appeared, wrapping Chen Tao and Betty as well as the bed inside, cutting off the sight of Hongyu and Haiyu. Hongyu blinked. Inside the cube, Chen Tao looked at Betty in his arms and said with a smile, "Let's continue." Betty's face turned red and she slowly closed her eyes. "Lilikan, what a pervert!" she complained in Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao smiled. "The big pervert is here." Outside the cube, Hongyu folded her hands on her chest, looked at Haiyu, and said, "If you want to sow discord between Chen Tao and Betty, then you have made the wrong calculation. The dragon girl culture of the dragon people's civilization is for every female dragon person. It's deep-rooted. Betty is already Chen Tao's woman, so for Betty, what Chen Tao wants is her wish. Chen Tao is the king of dragons. Of course he can't let Betty go find trouble with Katie." Haiyu sat on the sofa with her legs crossed and her hands folded across her chest. She looked over at the cube. As if she hadn't heard Hongyu's words, she looked at the cube in a daze and said, "What do you think they are doing inside?" When Hongyu heard this, she blushed slightly. Although Hongyu was inexperienced, anyone with a little common sense knew what they were going to do in this cube. Hongyu did not answer Haiyu. Haiyu said, "Betty doesn't seem to hate that kind of thing. I still remember when I was doing research in Dragon City, Betty said that there is no man in the known universe who is worthy of her. As a result, the second time we met, Betty actually became that man's woman." Looking at Betty's expression, although she looks reluctant on the surface, in fact, it can be seen that she is very happy. I have never seen such an expression on her face. Hongyu was silent and didn't speak. For Haiyu, Betty is an old acquaintance, and Haiyu is certainly qualified to say such things. There was envy in Haiyu's eyes. She hid her envy and withdrew her gaze. As a member of the dragon people, Haiyu actually hopes that she can have someone to love her as much as she loves Betty. After all, she is also a woman and needs to rely on. Especially when she stayed in a deserted planet for such a long time, loneliness was the thing she hated most. "Betty, are you free yet?" Haiyu said to herself subconsciously. Hongyu looked at Haiyu, looking at Haiyu's somewhat lost expression. She didn't say anything, she just watched quietly. Other side. The space outside the Earth star trembled slightly. A woman appeared out of thin air outside the Earth star. This woman has long red hair, a pair of red wings behind her, and dragon horns. She is wearing red soft armor, which fits her tall figure, making her look very proud. With long crimson hair hanging naturally behind her back, this woman has a beautiful face. The S-shaped figure and long, straight legs are amazing. This woman exudes the aura of a superior person, as if she is aloof from above. This woman is none other than Red Dragon King Betty. Betty from Epcot. 4 artificial humans were sent over in succession, but the result was like a mud cow entering the sea, without any movement. The hot-tempered future Betty chose to come by herself. Master 2 artificial humans appeared in front of future Betty and saluted to future Betty. Future Betty looked at one of the androids and said, "You two weren't destroyed, why don't you continue the mission?" One of the androids said to future Betty, "Master, we are now carrying out the tasks you gave us." Future Betty pondered for a moment and said, "Is it being executed? So what are you doing now? Why don't you go after Haiyu?" Future Betty crossed her arms and looked at the 2 androids slowly. The 2 androids looked at each other, seemingly confused. One of the androids looked at future Betty and said, it was you who asked us to abandon the previous mission and then let us protect the Earth. Nonsense. Future Betty frowned and said inexplicably, when will I give you such a task? The artificial man looked at Future Betty and said, Master, you asked us to do this. Seeing the android being so persistent, Future Betty seemed to realize something, and she frowned. Am I the one who gave you orders? Yes. Future Betty squinted her eyes. With Future Betty's wisdom, she was a little confused at first, but after thinking about it, she understood. Is it from the past? Future Betty shook her head and said, No, the past me has no reason or any need to hinder me. Future Betty will naturally understand present Betty. No one knows herself better than herself. But no matter what Betty thinks in the future, she doesn't think that herself in this timeline will interfere with her killing Hyu. There is absolutely no reason for this. It's interesting, Future Betty suddenly said, after being the king of the universe for so long, my life is very boring every day. Now I finally do something interesting. Capture the data of another me, Future Betty said. Capture successful, a mechanical voice sounded. Future Betty crossed her arms and said lightly, teleport me to the other me, I want to meet her and have a chat. Start teleporting. Future Betty's figure disappeared instantly. When she appeared again, the figure of Future Betty appeared in a room. She looked around. Betty, Hangyu's face changed drastically. She hurried to Hyu's side and protected Hyu behind her. She looked pale and looked at Betty. Future Betty looked at Hangyu's expression and said, well, I recognize you. You are Lin's new dragon claw, called Hangyu, right? Hangyu frowned tightly. Future Betty's sight fell on Hyu. Seeing Hyu, Future Betty smiled and said, Hyu, long time no see. Your time machine has caused me a lot of trouble. Hyu was stunned for a moment, looked at Betty in front of her, and blinked her eyes with disbelief. Future Betty's sight fell on Hangyu again and said, you don't have to be so nervous. I have no plans to beat Hyu yet. I want to talk to my past self. Where is my past self? Her data is clearly here. As she spoke, Future Betty looked around and her sight fell on the dark cube next to her. Here, right, Future Betty waved her hand. The black cube suddenly disappeared. Disappeared. The scene in front of her made Future Betty stunned. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 292. As soon as the cube disappears, you can see the scene inside. On the big bed, Chen Tao and Betty are entangled. Feeling the light coming from the side, Chen Tao and Betty look in the direction of the light together. Future Betty was stunned. She looked at Betty in front of her. Betty, who was as petite as a little loli, was leaning in the arms of a man, her hair was messy and her eyes were blurred. With that look, anyone with eyes would know what was going on. Future Betty raised her hand. The cube appeared, and the dark cube hid the group. Future Betty stared at the dark cube in front of her blankly, her ruby-like eyes trembling slightly, full of disbelief. Impossible, Future Betty was a little unbelievable, her eyebrows frowned. Nothing is impossible, Hyu suddenly spoke. Future Betty was startled. She looked at Hyu and said, Hyu, what's going on? Why did I get together with that man in the past? Hyu crossed her arms, leaned against the back of the sofa, looked at Future Betty, and said slowly, you may think that the timeline you are in is the real timeline. You think that if I kill you, the timeline will return to normal, but in fact, the timeline you were in before was created by the time machine. If there is no time machine, that timeline will no longer exist. Future Betty frowned, she turned her head and looked at the dark cube. In other words, if no one changes the real timeline, then there will be a man next to me. She seemed to be talking to herself. Hyu looked at Future Betty and said, Betty, if you want to continue to rule your universe and have your present future, you should not kill me, but protect me and support me in inventing the time machine. Only in this way can you have your present future. Hangyu frowned when she heard this, stared at future Betty nervously, and said, Red Dragon King. I will never hand Hyu over to you, and I will never allow her to invent the time machine. Future Betty heard what Hyu and Hangyu said. She turned her head and looked at the two of them, and said lightly, I want to meet my past self. Whether Hyu is dead or alive, I will make a decision after meeting my past self. You two, just stay here honestly. The voice fell. Hangyu was shocked. She was about to move and open her mouth, but she was shocked to find that she couldn't move, as if she was fixed. Hyu next to her seemed to be the same, unable to move. Hangyu's face turned pale. This is Betty from the future world. The technology that Betty has is not something that Hangyu and Hyu can resist. Future Betty folded her arms around her chest. A chair was programmed next to her and she slowly sat on it. Crossed her legs and looked at the dark cube. Waiting quietly. About 15 minutes later. Two figures walked out of the black cube. They were Chen Tao and Betty. Both of them were dressed, but Betty was still wearing less, just a long shirt. Because of her small body, the shirt looked like a skirt. Betty looked at future Betty. The two looked at each other. They stared at each other. Future Betty smiled. Betty frowned and folded her arms around her chest. Future Betty's eyes fell on Chen Tao, and she smiled and said, You are my, lover. When Betty heard this, she quickly said, Nonsense, he is my man, not your man. When future Betty heard this, she was not angry, but smiled. She seemed very satisfied with Betty's reaction now. Future Betty looked at present Betty and said, What's the condition of your body? Why did you become like this? When Betty heard this, she puffed her cheeks and said, None of your business, I will become whatever I like. But what are you doing here? Are you here to kill Hyu? When future Betty heard this, she smiled and said playfully, No hurry, Hyu's business is not urgent. I am more interested in your business now, so, can I infer that the reason you became like this is to cater to this man's taste? Betty blushed, she glared at future Betty and said, He is a Lolita control, but I will not cater to him. I just became like this because of an accident. If you don't kill Hyu, go back quickly and be your Red Dragon King. No, no, no. Future Betty smiled and said, Since I'm here, I don't want to go back so soon. At least, I have to figure out your business before I talk about it. How did you get together? I really want to know this question. Curiosity hung on the beautiful face of future Betty. Betty frowned, looked at Chen Tao, and said, Tao, ignore her. When future Betty heard this, she smiled and said, Honey, can you tell me something? Her eyes fell on Chen Tao. It seemed that it was not wrong for her to call Chen Tao like this, after all, she was originally Betty. However, Betty was unhappy, and she said, Don't talk nonsense, Chen Tao is my dear, not yours. Future Betty smiled and said, You can't say that, I am you, and you are me. If that's the case, then why should we separate each other? Betty puffed up her cheeks and said, You are in need of a man, right? You rule the entire universe now. If you want a man, just find one yourself. What's going on here, trying to steal a man from me? When Chen Tao on the side saw this, he was a little confused. What is going on? Originally, Chen Tao thought that Hyu would suffer if future Betty came here, and he was thinking about how to deal with future Betty. But Chen Tao never expected that when Betty came here in the future, the first thing she would do would be to gossip about the affairs between Chen Tao and Betty, and even call Chen Tao dear? He couldn't turn his head around. Future Betty looked at Betty and said, You also know that in the future world, I am the king of the universe, the supreme king of the universe. Which man dares to touch me? Those men who don't even dare to touch me are a little bit no interest either. Becoming the Red Dragon King to rule the universe is not something you don't know, but after you do it, you realize that it is a very boring thing, boring and boring. Future Betty said, during that time, I focused on my self-research on technology, so you won't die of boredom. Future Betty looked at Betty and said with a smile, I envy you, there is a man who will love you and love you. I thought my man didn't exist at all. Betty frowned, then you mean, you really want to steal a man from me? When Future Betty heard this, she smiled, I told you, you misunderstood. I am you are me, how can there be such a thing as robbing a man? Betty puffed up her face and said, anyway, I don't care, you are not allowed to touch this man, he is mine. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 293. Future Betty looked at Betty, she crossed her arms over her chest and said with a smile, yes, he is mine. Betty was startled, and she said, I mean, he is mine, not yours. Future Betty smiled, stood up, and said, that's not necessarily the case. You are me, I am you, it is yours, of course it is mine. Betty puffed up her cheeks in anger, you. Seeing this, Chen Tao said, okay. Both Bettys stopped arguing and looked at Chen Tao together. Chen Tao looked at Future Betty and said, aren't you here to kill Haiyu? Future Betty looked at Chen Tao and said, if this timeline is the real timeline, and my timeline was modified by the time machine, then what I should do is not kill Hai Month. If I kill Haiyu, my timeline will probably cease to exist. Then what I should do is protect Haiyu so that Haiyu can invent a time machine. Future Betty crossed her chest with her hands, crossed her legs, looked at Chen Tao, and said, however, I am hesitant now. Chen Tao was slightly startled, looked at Future Betty, and said, why are you hesitating? Future Betty looked at Chen Tao and said, I'm thinking, is it appropriate to return the timeline to normal, or is it appropriate to keep the timeline as it is now? Does this need to be considered? Betty looked at Future Betty and said, in this timeline, you failed. The dragon civilization rules the universe, but in that timeline, you are high above, you are the red dragon, he is the king of the universe. Are you still not satisfied? Future Betty looked at Betty, she smiled and said, you are me, I am you. You understand me, do you think I will be satisfied? Betty was slightly startled, she frowned and looked at Future Betty. Future Betty looked at Betty and said, grunt against the dragon civilization, overthrow the rule of Kadi, and then let the red dragon civilization rule the universe. Then what? Future Betty looked at Betty with her ruby eyes and said, then it's gone. It's boring. The feeling is actually the same as being exiled by Katie and staying in that prison-like planet. It's just that it's just a bigger prison. Death is not scary, and failure is not scary either. Future Betty said, loneliness is the most terrifying thing. Aloof, as the king of the universe, haha, it sounds very powerful, but in reality, Future Betty continued, there is no one around me who can speak. It's just a person like this, aloof, who has lived countless lives. Years ago. That feeling is more painful than death. Future Betty looked at Betty and said, I won't hide it from you either. In the past 3,000 years, I began to search the entire universe for a man who is suitable for me. Betty was stunned, her face flushed slightly, and she frowned, then you found it? Betty felt a little embarrassed, especially when she heard her future self say such things. Future Betty smiled, no, I can't find it. In my opinion, those people are just like ants, and no one is qualified to control me. However, when I came here, I discovered an unexpected thing. Her eyes fell on Chen Tao, and she smiled and said, "You seem to be able to control me." Betty was startled. She raised her hand and held Chen Tao's hand. She looked at future Betty with big eyes and said, "What do you want to do? Let me tell you, this man is a lolicon and a big pervert. You can't stand it." Chen Tao felt strange when he heard what he said. The development of things was completely beyond Chen Tao's expectation. He originally thought that Betty, who had never come from the future, would come to kill Haiyu. If Betty wants to kill Haiyu in the future, the technology of the known universe has no ability to stop Betty from coming in the future. In the future, if Betty wants to kill Haiyu, no one can stop her. But the problem is, Chen Tao never expected that Betty would be interested in Chen Tao in the future. And what Betty means in the future is that she wants Chen Tao? "Are you a lolicon?" Future Betty looked curious. She looked at Betty and said, "That's strange. How can you tolerate him so well?" Betty blushed and said, "It's up to you." Future Betty looked at Betty's blushing look, and there was a glint in her eyes. She said, "Are you a lolicon? This is quite interesting." With that said, future Betty stood up. Under Chen Tao's gaze, future Betty retracted the dragon wings and horns behind her. Then a blue light appeared all over future Betty's body, and a blue coat appeared. Under the gaze of the naked eye, future Betty's body suddenly disappears. Then it appeared again out of thin air. Seeing the future Betty in front of him, Chen Tao was stunned. In the future, Betty turned into a Lolita like Betty, with a red shirt wrapped around her body. Future Betty has changed from the royal sister look just now to the petite and cute look now. Her skin is as white as cream, her figure is slender, and her waist is truly plump. She has long hair as red as flames and a pair of eyes as red as rubies. Red shirt. This red body combined with her snow-white cream makes her fair and delicate skin even whiter. The hem of the shirt is very short, and her slender legs are naturally exposed. Future Betty is so cute at the moment. Just like Betty now. Future Betty and Betty are almost identical, like twins, the only difference is their shirts. However, they are the same person, so it is normal. Future Betty looked at Chen Tao, with a smile on her face, and said with a smile, "Will you feel excited about this?" Betty was stunned. She held Chen Tao's palm, looked at future Betty and said, "You are too perverted. You can do such a thing." She hurriedly looked at Chen Tao and said, "Tao, don't be confused by her, she is not Betty." Chen Tao looked at Betty's panic, he couldn't help but smile, raised his hand, touched Betty's hair, and said, "Okay, it's nothing to be jealous of yourself." Betty was stunned. She puffed her cheeks and said, I am different from her." "There is nothing different." Future Betty crossed her arms, looked at Betty and smiled, "If the timeline I am in has not been tampered with, then I am also his woman." Betty puffed her cheeks, she looked at future Betty and said, "Then you should go to find Chen Tao in your timeline, not the one on my side." Future Betty looked at Betty, she looked enlightened, and said, "This is a good suggestion, then I will go back." "Do as you say." Future Betty's figure disappeared on the spot. Seeing the place where future Betty disappeared, Betty was slightly relieved. She looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked at Betty and their eyes met. Betty puffed her cheeks and said, "Lolita control, pervert. Just now you insisted, and when you saw her become a loli, you started to speak for her. Are you thinking of doing something bad? My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 294. This Betty is too keen. When Chen Tao saw future Betty in the form of a Lolita, a picture immediately came to his mind. Chen Tao is lying on the bed, with Betty on the left and future Betty on the right. The feeling of being surrounded by two little beauties who look exactly the same will probably be wonderful. It's just a pity that they just left. Of course Chen Tao would not admit this. Chen Tao picked up Betty, turned around, threw her on the bed, and pressed her down on the bed. He looked into her eyes and said with a smile, "I was right, she was you, she will be you in the future. Why are you jealous? Are you afraid that she will take me away? This is too unconfident. It seems that I have to let you feel how much I love you." Betty's face turned red. Lolacan, big pervert. Seeing Chen Tao's face slowly approaching, Betty blushed. Stop making trouble. She turned her face slightly and blushed. She was really irresistible to him. Suddenly, the space around him fluctuated. Chen Tao and Betty came to their senses together and looked at the source of the fluctuation. Take a look. Discovering that future Betty in the form of a loli was back, she looked at the two people on the bed, her eyes lit up slightly, and there was a smile on her face, and she said, "It seems that I came at the right time, please continue, I'll look into it." Betty's pupils froze slightly. She struggled to get up and said, "Why are you coming back?" Chen Tao also stood up and looked at future Betty. Future Betty sat on a chair, folded her hands on her chest, crossed her legs, looked at the two of them, and said, "I went back to the future to look for Chen Tao's data, but unfortunately, there is no data like Chen Tao in my universe." "Has it been erased?" Betty frowned. Future Betty said, "Maybe, but it doesn't matter. He is in this timeline anyway, isn't it?" Betty was slightly startled and said, "No, I don't want it." Her face turned red and she said, "What's the matter with you? The majestic king of the universe, are you so shameless? You actually went back in time to compete with your past self for a man." Future Betty smiled slightly and said, "I didn't rob, I said, I am you, you are me, how can this be considered robbery?" Betty pursed her thin lips and looked at Chen Tao. "Tell her about her too. Tell her that you are not interested in her and let her go back." Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled, looked at Betty, and said with a smile, "I can't say this." Betty was startled. She frowned and said, "You." She puffed up her face and became a little angry. Chen Tao said, "She is actually you in the future. In my eyes, you two are the same person. You asked me to tell you in the future that I am not interested in you." He held Betty's little hand, looked into her eyes, and said softly, "How can I say it?" Betty's heart skipped a beat, and after thinking about it carefully, she realized that indeed, what Chen Tao said made sense. Although that woman seemed different from herself in Betty's eyes, she was actually Betty, just Betty from the future. Let Chen Tao say that he is not interested in her in the future. This is also embarrassing for Chen Tao. Betty sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Chen Tao with big eyes, but she didn't know what to say for a moment. Seeing Betty's scene, Chen Tao approached Betty and kissed her thin lips. Parted lips. Chen Tao looked at Betty's hazy ruby-like eyes and said softly, "You are my woman, no matter in the past or in the future, I will love you deeply." Betty's eyes were filled with a trace of blurred moisture as she looked at Chen Tao. Okay, Betty responded softly. Seeing Betty's well-behaved appearance, Chen Tao smiled. He sat next to her, raised his hand, hugged her slender shoulders, gently stroked and comforted her. Feeling Chen Tao's tenderness, Betty closed her eyes and rested her little head on Chen Tao's shoulder. Looking at this warm appearance, future Betty's eyes were filled with a hint of envy. She spread out a pair of dragon wings behind her and flew up. Chen Tao felt a scent coming over him, and a beautiful shadow fell in Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao was startled, then subconsciously raised his hand and hugged her slender waist. In the future, Betty took the initiative to sit in Chen Tao's arms. She raised her face, looked at Chen Tao, and said with a smile, "Then, can you tell me? How did you know me in the past?" Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled, "Well, I don't think there's anything to say, right?" Future Betty's eyebrows stretched slightly and she said, "If you don't tell me, then I'll see it myself." She stared at Chen Tao, her eyes glowing with blue code. Warning, someone has invaded the master's database. Nebula's voice sounded. Do you want to stop it? Hear this sound. Chen Tao was silent for a moment, and said in his heart, show her what happened between me and Betty. Yes. The blue code in future Betty's eyes dissipated. She looked at Chen Tao and smiled. Sure enough, I was right about you in the past. You are indeed a Lolita and a pervert. The corner of Chen Tao's mouth twitched and he said, is that memory very perverted? Future Betty stretched her eyebrows and looked at Betty beside her. That Betty was looking at future Betty. Eyes facing each other. Future Betty laughed and said, I never thought that in the past, I would actually fall in love with a lolicon. Betty frowned and said, it's up to you. If you don't like him, you will go back. I like him, that's fine. Future Betty smiled, her arms crossed over her chest. Although I don't quite understand, I can be sure that you are in love with him, and your happiness is not fake. Betty blushed slightly and said, how can I be happy? Okay, go back, your timeline also needs you. Future Betty's eyes fell on Chen Tao. She smiled and said, then, Chen Tao, let me ask you something. Chen Tao looked at Future Betty. Future Betty looked at Chen Tao and said, Lin in my timeline sent Hangyu to protect Haiyu and also prohibited Haiyu from inventing a time machine. I can restrict Hangyu and then let Haiyu discover the time machine. If I don't do it, then my timeline will disappear and I will no longer exist. Future Betty said, help me make a choice, should I let Haiyu invent a time machine or not? If she invents it, the timeline will continue to be chaotic, but I can exist. If she doesn't invent it, then time will be restored and I will disappear. She looked at Chen Tao and said, honey, help me make a choice, okay. Chen Tao looked at Future Betty, and he was silent for a while. So how to choose? Everyone in the room looked at Chen Tao. So what will Chen Tao choose? Chen Tao, at some point, Hangyu could move. Hangyu looked at Chen Tao and said, we can't let Haiyu invent a time machine. If we let Haiyu invent it, everything will be messed up. The timeline will be a mess. And in my timeline, you will be erased because of the invention of the time machine. The universe will be in chaos. We must never let the time machine be invented. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 295. Future Betty looked at Hangyu, then she looked at Chen Tao, and said with a smile, then what are you going to choose? You are my man. Although it was my choice in the past, since I chose this way in the past, then it is also my choice. I approve of you. I will comply with your choice. Chen Tao Hangyu was a little anxious. She said, this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity to return the timeline to normal. Chen Tao looked at Future Betty. Is Betty hateful? Chen Tao does not think Betty is a hateful person. The conflict between her and Katie comes from their different ideas. This is about war caused by differences of opinion. In fact, when Betty is away from ideological contradictions, she is also very cute, and she does not deserve to die. If Haiyu is not allowed to invent the time machine, the timeline will return to normal and everything will be back on track. If Haiyu is allowed to invent the time machine, the timeline will continue to be chaotic and nothing will change. But if Haiyu is not allowed to invent the time machine, then the Betty in front of her will cease to exist. How to choose? Chen Tao thought for a while and said, if you will die if you do that, I think it is better to let Haiyu invent the time machine. Chen Tao, Hangyu's face changed drastically, and she said, are you crazy? Future Betty was also slightly stunned. She looked at Chen Tao, and suddenly, Future Betty smiled. Ha ha. Seeing Future Betty laughing, everyone in the room was a little confused. Chen Tao looked at Future Betty and said, why are you laughing? Future Betty stopped smiling. She looked at Betty next to her and said with a smile, I finally understand why you are willing to become a Lolita and stay with him. He is sincere to you. Betty looked at future Betty and said, it's up to you. In the future, Betty got off Chen Tao's arms. She looked at Haiyu and said with a smile, Haiyu, I'm sorry. Haiyu was startled, what do you mean? Future Betty raised her hand to Haiyu and shook her hand. Haiyu's pupils condensed slightly, and she slowly fell onto the sofa and fell into coma. Hangyu was stunned. She suddenly looked at future Betty, what did you do? Future Betty folded her hands on her chest, looked at the red moon, and said, don't worry, I know the bad things about your dragon civilization. You don't want to kill her, and I didn't kill her either. I just cleared part of her database. Wait. When she woke up, she was just an 8-year-old girl. Hangyu was stunned, you don't want her to invent a time machine. She couldn't believe that Betty would do this in the future. If the time machine disappears, then the timeline where future Betty is will disappear, and then future Betty will also disappear. If Betty does this in the future, it will be equivalent to committing suicide. Hangyu never expected that Betty would do such a thing in the future. Future Betty looked at Chen Tao and said, in my timeline, you have been erased by someone using a time machine. Although I don't know who did it, but for me, without your timeline, it would be boring. Like a huge prison. She crossed her arms across her chest, looked at Chen Tao, and said with a smile, since you don't exist in that timeline, then let that timeline also not exist. My dear, please forgive me for my willfulness. She committed suicide. Yes, Haiyu's database is actually Haiyu's memory. If Haiyu's memory is gone, then the time machine will naturally not be able to study it. If Haiyu cannot invent a time machine, the time machine will cease to exist, and the countless timelines caused by the rupture of time will once again converge into one. And in the future, Betty and Hangyu are naturally people who should not exist. In the future Betty will disappear, she is committing suicide. Suddenly, future Betty's eyebrows frowned slightly, she raised her hand and looked at her hand. There was a bit of doubt and confusion on her little face. What's wrong? Betty asked. When future Betty heard this, she looked at Betty and said, that's weird, it shouldn't be. She looked at Haiyu lying on the sofa and said, when I understand Haiyu's database, the time machine should disappear from now on. The other timelines will converge and become only one timeline. And it should also disappear, but now future Betty has not disappeared. Did it fail? Future Betty said, my timeline still exists. Can we only kill her to completely eradicate the time machine? Future Betty said slowly, and there was a hint of chill in her eyes when she looked at Haiyu. Chen Tao seemed to realize something. He looked at Hangyu and said, Hangyu, look at your wrist. Look at your wrist. Future Betty looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao said, yes, as long as a time machine is used, a time rupture will appear on everyone's wrist, and their time will begin to flow. If you want to judge whether there is any news about the disappearance of the time rupture, you only need to look at yourself. You'll know the time on your wrist. If you fail, you too are from the future, and the time on your wrists must still maintain the posture of time being broken, that is, the posture of flowing. If successful, the time break on your wrists will return to its previous infinity posture. Yes, Hangyu raised her wrist and looked at it. Future Betty also raised her wrist and looked at it. Upon seeing it, future Betty's eyes narrowed slightly. Hangyu looked at Chen Tao with disbelief and doubt on her face. It turned back to the symbol of infinity. Chen Tao's heart moved slightly, and he looked at future Betty, what about you? Future Betty looked at Chen Tao and said, my wrist is also the symbol of infinity. In other words, the time break is gone. Future Betty said, we succeeded, but, Hangyu and I did not disappear. Future Betty raised her eyebrows, this. She was a little confused. You are now at the intersection of timelines, a voice sounded. The voice in the house looked at the source of the sound. I saw a woman with snow-white hair over there, wearing a white soft armor and a white cloak, standing aside, with her hands around her chest, leaning against the wall. She looked over here. Bai Yao Betty looked at it, and her eyes condensed slightly. Future Betty looked at Bai Yao and said, "Oh, an old friend is here. Oh, I remember that you seem to have studied time with Haiu before. So what's the matter with the timeline intersection you just mentioned?" Bai Yao looked at Future Betty and said, "Timelines are generally parallel and there is no possibility of intersection, but the existence of time machines. The intersection that leads to the appearance of timelines, simply put. You and Hangyu are from another timeline, but you appear on this timeline. In this way, the two timelines intersect." Bai Yao looked at the two and said, "When the time break disappears and the timeline you are in disappears, because you two are in this real timeline, from the perspective of time, you are people of this real timeline. This leads to the phenomenon that the timeline you were in before disappears, but you haven't disappeared yet. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 296. The Intersection of Timelines. Chen Tao looked at Future Betty. "If you say that, you won't disappear." Future Betty was slightly startled, her eyes glowing with luster, and she subconsciously looked at Chen Tao and said, "I was tired of that timeline. I thought I would disappear, but I didn't expect it to be like this." Bai Yao crossed his arms and said calmly, "From a certain point of view, even if you are not on this timeline, you are not dead. When time returns to normal, isn't the you next to you the same?" Future Betty subconsciously looked at Betty sitting on the edge of the bed. She smiled and said, "Same." Seeing that Future Betty would not disappear, Chen Tao met Future Betty's gaze and he smiled at her. Future Betty smiled back, her ruby eyes glowing with a hint of luster. However, when this happens, a problem arises, Bai Yao suddenly said. Everyone's eyes fell on Bai Yao. Bai Yao slowly released her hand, and her eyes fell on Future Betty. She said, "You come from the future, and the technology you have is something we don't have here. Your existence has affected the balance of the universe. And in your other timeline, you overthrew the rule of the dragon civilization and became the king of the red dragon civilization, in charge of the entire universe. Given your performance in your timeline, I think you are not only a threat to the balance of the universe, but you are also a threat to our dragon civilization. Our dragon civilization cannot just sit idly by and ignore your existence." Bai Yao looked at Future Betty and said, "I want to know, if you stay in this timeline, what are you going to do? Help present Betty, overthrow the rule of dragon civilization, and take revenge on Katie?" Bai Yao's expression was dignified and serious. Yes, what Bai Yao said does make sense. The technology owned by Future Betty, even if Chen Tao is now competing with Future Betty, he may not be able to win. Betty's existence in the future will have a huge impact on the present. If she wants to change the current structure of the world, then the universe will undergo huge changes. Now Betty's thoughts in the future are very important. If she has bad thoughts, then the universe is destined to be in chaos. Future Betty looked at Bai Yao, she smiled, crossed her arms and said, "If it were in the past, I would probably consider overthrowing Katie's rule like before, and then become the king of the universe." Bai Yao frowned. "But now?" Future Betty crossed her arms and said, "I have been the king of this universe for millions of years, and all it brings me is boredom. Successful revenge on Katie will bring nothing but joy. It's just boring. It doesn't mean anything. Sometimes when I think about it, it doesn't make any sense." Future Betty looked at Betty and said, "I even envy her a little. Although she failed to overthrow Katie's rule, there are people around her. She has a man who loves her and loves her. Compared with her, I feel like my millions of years have been in vain." Meeting Betty's gaze in the future, Betty's face turned slightly red, and she looked at Chen Tao. In other words, meeting this lolicon and pervert was actually a lucky thing for her? So, Bai Yao looked at future Betty. What are you going to do next? Future Betty stood on the cold floor holding her little feet. She crossed her arms over her chest, thought for a moment, and looked at Chen Tao beside her with her big eyes. She smiled playfully and said, I might consider having a few children with him. Watching future Betty smile cutely, and then, as if innocently, she said those words that made Chen Tao a little stunned. Bai Yao on the side was also stunned. Betty was slightly startled, her face turned red, and she said, What's the matter with you? Can you say this? Although Betty did not object to doing something with Chen Tao, she still couldn't do it if she was asked to give birth to a child for Chen Tao. But Betty didn't expect that her future self would actually have a child with Chen Tao as soon as she opened her mouth. Thinking that this was her future self, Betty blushed and felt embarrassed. Future Betty looked at Betty and said with a smile, I have lived millions of years longer than you and been alone for millions of years. What I think may not be the same as yours. I have always thought about a man. And then give birth to a child and live like ordinary people, it should feel very interesting. Betty's face turned red. She rolled her eyes at future Betty and said, shameless. She looked at Chen Tao and said, she comes from the future and is different from me. I will definitely not be like her in the future. She really felt ashamed. Seeing Betty's blushing explanation, Chen Tao couldn't help but smile. He raised his hand, picked up Betty, and let Betty sit in his arms. He moved closer to Betty. Betty watched Chen Tao's face getting closer and closer, and her baby blushed a little. Chen Tao kissed her. Parted lips. Chen Tao looked at Betty's red face and said with a smile, I like you both now and in the future. Betty's ruby-like eyes were glowing with crystal water. She looked at Chen Tao and her cheeks turned even redder. Chen Tao said, how about, you can also give birth to one for me. Betty's face flushed and turned red. She hid her cerebellum in Chen Tao's arms, beat Chen Tao's chest with her little hands and said, bad guy, pervert. Feeling Betty's shyness, Chen Tao smiled, gently hugged her and squeezed her shoulders. Looking at Betty's demeanor, future Betty's eyes were shining, and she pursed her tender thin lips, not knowing what she was thinking. Bai Yao looked at this scene, and then looked at future Betty, aren't you going to overthrow the dragon civilization? This attracted the attention of other people in the room, and Chen Tao also looked at future Betty. Future Betty looked at Bai Yao, she smiled and said, in this timeline, the king of the dragon civilization is Chen Tao is my man, and I want me to overthrow the universe ruled by my man. I think I shouldn't be so stupid, right? And I'm too lazy to manage this universe now. It's a piece of shit, and it's very annoying. Whoever wants to manage it, let them manage it. Future Betty flapped her dragon wings, landed beside Chen Tao, and sat down on the edge of the bed. Her dragon wings folded, she approached Chen Tao, and followed Betty, sticking to Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked at future Betty, who looked at him with big eyes, a smile on her face, and said, can you treat me like you treated her? Hearing this, Betty looked at future Betty, and then looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao smiled, put his arm around future Betty's shoulders, and said, you are Betty, even if you are from the future, you are still Betty. Future Betty's eyes lit up slightly, and the look she gave Chen Tao was even more brilliant. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 297. Future Betty held Chen Tao's big hand, she looked at Chen Tao and said, then, Chen Tao, can we do something else? Something else? Chen Tao looked at future Betty in confusion. Future Betty's cheeks also blushed a little, she wanted to get close to Chen Tao's ear, but because of her petite figure, she couldn't do it. She said, put your ear close to me. Her face was red. Chen Tao approached future Betty, and future Betty leaned close to Chen Tao's ear and said, I want a child. What is this? A hint? No, this should be a clear indication. Chen Tao looked at future Betty. Future Betty's face was red, and her ruby eyes were shining with expectation. Looking at future Betty's beautiful baby face, looking at her slender and petite body under the red shirt. Going down, the hem of the shirt was very short, and her legs were slender and straight. Although she was petite, her body proportions were perfect, with a tight waist and slender legs. Her skin was fair. With the red eyes and long red hair, it gives people an exotic style. Chen Tao retracted his gaze and looked at Betty in his arms. Seeing the delicate and moving little face of Betty in the future, and then looking at the delicate face of Betty in his arms. Seeing these two identical faces, Chen Tao's heartbeat slightly accelerated. Too cute. Chen Tao did not speak, got up, hugged Betty, and then laid Betty flat on the bed. Betty was startled, her face blushed, and said, What? Don't make trouble, she teased you, not me, don't make a mistake. If you want to bully her, I'm wearing a white shirt. Chen Tao held Betty's little hand, looked at Betty's face, and smiled and said, Then, I want you, okay? Betty was slightly startled. Is it okay? How should she answer this question? Say no, but so many people are watching, and the future self is also watching her. If you say no, then the future self who is a little perverted will definitely take her place. In this case, this man can't spend more time with her? Thinking of this, Betty was a little afraid to say no. But if she said yes, wouldn't it be obvious that she would be bullied by this man? For a moment, Betty didn't know what to say, but her face was red. Chen Tao leaned close to Betty's ear and said, Dear, can you? The warm breath penetrated into her ears, and Betty's heart was trembling. She slowly closed her eyes and said a very light voice, and her face turned red as the sound came. A black cube swallowed up Chen Tao, Betty, and future Betty, including the bed. Bai Yao, who was standing aside, was slightly stunned when she saw this. Really, Bai Yao realized what was going on, and her face couldn't help but blush. Bai Yao adjusted her mentality and looked at Hongyu. Hongyu met Bai Yao's gaze. Hongyu's eyes trembled slightly. She quickly performed a dragon civilization salute to Biao and said, Hongyu greets the White Dragon King. Biao said, I have been watching you. I already know about you. You should not be needed here now, and the timeline you are in no longer exists. In this case, I will take you to the dragon civilization and use the technology you brought from the future to help our dragon civilization improve its technological strength. Yes, Hongyu was respectful. Biao opened a micro wormhole. She glanced at Haiyu, who was lying unconscious on the sofa, and said, Take her with you. Hongyu nodded slightly and picked up Haiyu. The two entered the micro wormhole and disappeared in the room. The only thing left in the room was the dark cube. The cube existed for a long time, about 10 hours. It was night. The lights in the bedroom came on automatically. The black cube gradually dissipated. On the bed, Chen Tao looked at the little red-haired girl on the right. She closed her eyes and had a happy and satisfied smile on her face. There was another red-haired girl on the left. She also closed her eyes, her face was red, and there was a faint smile on her face. The two girls looked exactly the same, even their sleeping positions were the same. Before, the shirts could distinguish the identities of the two, but now the two girls were lying in the quilt. Chen Tao couldn't tell which one was the present and which one was the future. This feeling was very novel, but for Chen Tao, it was quite interesting. Suddenly, there was movement on the right. The girl on the right moved closer to Chen Tao, snuggled into his arms, and felt her move. Chen Tao smiled, slightly turned sideways, and gently hugged her into his arms. Betty snuggled in Chen Tao's arms, and joy could be seen on her face. "Today I can feel that I am still alive," Betty said softly. Hearing this, Chen Tao's heart moved, and he looked at Betty in his arms. Needless to say, the Betty who said this is the future Betty. Chen Tao smiled, said nothing, and gently stroked her long red hair. Betty behind him also came over. "Tao, I want a hug." After the intimate, Betty's favorite thing is to be held in Chen Tao's arms. But Chen Tao turned his back to her, which made Betty uncomfortable. Chen Tao was slightly startled when he heard it. Now, Chen Tao was in trouble. There is only one hug, and it is not good to let go of the one in his arms now. Future Betty's mouth corners slightly raised, she opened her eyes, looked at Chen Tao, lowered her voice and said, "Hug her." Chen Tao was slightly startled, he looked at future Betty. Future Betty's ruby-like eyes were shining, and there was a smile on her face. Future Betty's experience was somewhat different from that of Betty now. Betty now was a little childish, while future Betty was more mature, perhaps because future Betty stood at the height of the king of the universe and had seen too many things. Chen Tao smiled, held future Betty's face, leaned close, kissed her forehead, and said, "So good." Chen Tao carefully let go of future Betty, turned around and hugged the somewhat greasy Betty into his arms. Betty was in his arms, and her slightly frowned eyebrows were slightly relaxed, and there was a smile on her face, and she slowly leaned closer to Chen Tao's arms. Future Betty rested her head on the pillow, looking at Chen Tao's back, and there was a smile on her face. "No wonder I was willing to satisfy your Lolita control in the past, become that look, and stay by your side," future Betty said softly. "It's great, the feeling of being loved by you." Chen Tao didn't say anything, just smiled and looked at Betty in his arms. Betty in his arms obviously heard the voice of future Betty, and her face turned red. Future Betty said, "Chen Tao, dear." She called Chen Tao's name, then slowly approached Chen Tao's back, with her forehead against Chen Tao's back. "Sure enough, the timeline with you is where I should stay. My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 298. Katie's residence. Has it been dealt with? Katie sat on the sofa, crossed her legs, and looked at Bai Yao in front of her. Bai Yao nodded slightly and said, "I told Wei Lia about the matter, and then handed over Hongyu and Haiyu to Wei Lia. Vilia asked Hongyu to help improve the technology of dragon civilization, and at the same time, let people take care of Haiyu who lost his memory." Bai Yao sat on the sofa, crossed his legs, and looked at Katie. Katie nodded slightly. "Well." Bai Yao looked at Katie and said, "There is actually another question that I haven't figured out yet." "What's the problem?" Katie looked at Bai Yao. Bai Yao said, "Although the problem of the timeline has been solved, and Betty who came from the future has also been solved, there is still another problem. In another timeline, Chen Tao was deliberately erased. Only with a time machine can this be done. At this point, there are only 3 people who have used the time machine. One is Chen Tao himself, the other is Hongyu who was sent by the dragon civilization in the future, and the third is Betty who came from the future. And the person who erased Chen Tao cannot be Chen Tao himself, nor should he be someone from Betty's side, nor can he be someone from the dragon civilization. I can't think of anyone who can use a time machine to go back to the past and erase Chen Tao's existence." Bai Yao looked at Katie. Katie said, "You're wrong." "Wrong," Bai Yao looked at Katie. Katie said, "There are more than just the 3 people you mentioned who have used time machines." Bai Yao frowned and thought for a moment. Her eyes lit up slightly, then she looked at Katie and said, "You mean, Haiyu?" In addition to the 3 people mentioned by Bai Yao, there is of course another person who uses the time machine, and that is the inventor of the time machine, Haiyu. The time machine she invented can naturally be used by herself. But this is impossible. Why would Haiyu go back to the past and erase Chen Tao? Bai Yao looked at Katie. Katie looked at Bai Yao and said, "Didn't you find anything strange when you were doing research with Betty and Haiu in Dragon City?" "Weird," Bai Yao was a little confused. Katie said, "Well, you are too focused on doing research and don't know Haiu's feelings for Betty. In fact, Haiu loves Betty deeply." "Ah," Bai Yao was stunned. She couldn't believe it. "How is it possible?" Katie said lightly, "Nothing is impossible. Haiu is a person who has been through a long time just like us. Her thoughts are different from ours. For her, love does not necessarily need to be between the opposite sex. Choose." "Do you still remember when Haiu became crazy?" Katie looked at Bai Yao. Bai Yao blinked and said, "I remember that 3 years after Betty was exiled, Haiu became crazy and spread those strange ideas everywhere. I have never understood why Haiu changed. Be like that." Bai Yao looked at Katie and said, "Listening to what you said, I seem to understand. Is she venting her anger on Betty?" Katie said, "She can't stay in Dragon City without Betty, so she naturally wants to make some noise. With these, you can make a judgment. Haiu really doesn't have any different ideas about Betty. Haiu loves Betty, but Haiu also knows that Betty will never accept Haiu. But, what will Haiu feel like when she sees Chen Tao and Betty together? It's not difficult to understand that she sat in a time machine, went back in time, and erased Chen Tao." Katie looked at Bai Yao and said, "First, she did it for her own selfish desires, and second, she felt that you can stop Betty from being disturbed by Chen Tao, so you can defeat us and become number one in the universe." Bai Yao blinked. "But," Katie said, "I guess she would never have thought of it. Betty's success could not bring her happiness. She was bored and lonely, making her miserable. As a result, when she came to this timeline, she discovered the existence of Chen Tao. Only after realizing that her destiny was being manipulated by others did she choose to give up everything." Katie said, "For Chen Tao, she would even sacrifice her own timeline and give up her life." "Haiu's plan completely failed," Katie said slowly. Listening to what Katie said, Bai Yao couldn't help but feel unbelievable. She never expected that this would be the case. "Then, what should we do next?" Bai Yao looked at Katie. Katie said, "Haiu has lost its own database, and its current wisdom is limited. A time machine cannot be invented, so we don't need to pay attention." Bai Yao looked at Katie and said, "Well, what about Betty in the future?" Katie thought for a moment, looked at Bai Yao, and said, "She doesn't need to worry anymore. In the future, Betty has gone through the baptism of time and her ambitions are gone. Now for her, she can stay in Chen Tao. Being around her is probably the greatest happiness for her. For her, it is a kind of happiness that has been lost and found, and she cannot relax easily." Katie smiled, "Besides, with my husband's charm, she will probably be completely addicted to him soon." Bai Yao nodded slightly. At this time, Katie subconsciously looked at Bai Yao and said, "By the way, Bai Yao, how did you realize this? When the other party came over, they used the power of technology to block the information. We simply couldn't. How did you notice their presence? Anyone who steps into this known universe." Bai Yao was slightly startled, and her expression became a little more embarrassed. She said, "I just saw it occasionally." Kadi looked at Bai Yao and smiled, "You didn't stare at Chen Tao all the time, did you?" Bai Yao blushed and said, I didn't stare at him, I just accidentally saw it occasionally." Kadi looked at Bai Yao and smiled, "Well, it's time to mention the back garden plan to my husband again." Bai Yao was startled, and she said, "Don't talk nonsense, I won't participate in that plan." Kadi smiled, "You can think about it more." "Don't even think about it." Bai Yao stood up and said, "I have something to do, I'll go back first." Bai Yao left. Kadi smiled at Bai Yao's back, who was running away. Kadi didn't believe it because she saw those scenes occasionally and accidentally. It seems that Bai Yao is still interested in her husband, Katie said. It seems that it's time to start implementing the back garden plan. Thinking of this, Katie smiled. On the other side, Chen Tao was also done. He came out of the bathroom in a bathrobe and glanced at the bed. There were two Bettys lying on the bed, resting with their eyes closed. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 299. Chen Tao sat on the sofa and looked at the blue sky and white clouds outside the floor-to-ceiling window. Time passed by minute. What are you thinking about? Came a voice from beside him. Chen Tao turned his face and saw future Betty wearing a red silk shirt. Future Betty walked on the cold floor and came to Chen Tao's side. There was a smile on her face, and she looked at Chen Tao with her big eyes. Chen Tao looked at future Betty, he smiled, and raised his hand to hold future Betty's little hand. Give it a gentle tug. Future Betty was held in Chen Tao's arms. Future Betty was slightly startled. She raised her face and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Why don't you sleep a little longer?" Future Betty's eyes were shining, she showed a smile, and she snuggled into Chen Tao's arms. She raised her face and looked at Chen Tao with her big eyes. She raised her small hand and gently touched Chen Tao's cheek. Her eyes were straight. He looked at Chen Tao softly, pursed his thin lips slightly, and said, "It's rare to have you by my side. How can I sleep without you?" Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled. Future Betty approached Chen Tao and kissed Chen Tao's face. Her ruby-like eyes showed slow attachment and love. Looking at future Betty's eyes, Chen Tao raised his hand, picked up the hair that was sticking to her cheek, and tucked it behind her ears. Feeling Chen Tao's movements, future Betty's eyes glowed with luster. She closed her eyes and pressed her little face into Chen Tao's palm. Just like a kitten, enjoying this tenderness. She is too cute. Compared with the current Betty, the future Betty did not hide her feelings at all. She completely let herself go and showed her love for Chen Tao. Only. Chen Tao looked at future Betty and said, "Betty." Huh? Future Betty looked at Chen Tao with her big eyes, a trace of obsession and doubt in her eyes. Chen Tao looked at future Betty and said, "We just met yesterday, but in the end, you gave yourself to me. Is this really okay?" This question should not have been asked after you have already obtained it, but should have been asked before. But before, future Betty was too enthusiastic, and Chen Tao was also hot-headed. As a man, of course he couldn't think too much. But now that he thought about this question, Chen Tao felt that he needed to ask it. Future Betty looked at Chen Tao, she smiled and said, "What does it matter? You are the man I chose. Since it is my choice, of course I will not refuse. And, leave it to you, for me, it's pretty good." Future Betty nestled her small body in Chen Tao's arms, closed her eyes, and looked enjoying herself. Being held by you, that feeling is very special. With you in my arms, I can feel my petiteness, my weakness, and then, I can feel your body temperature, your arms. That feeling of being protected. This sense of security is something I have never experienced before. Chen Tao looked at future Betty's expression of enjoyment, smiled, and gently stroked her long, silky red hair. Feeling Chen Tao's gentle embrace, the smile on future Betty's face grew slightly. She is very happy. Chen Tao looked at future Betty. He withdrew his gaze and looked at the scenery outside through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Husband. Suddenly, Chen Tao heard a voice. The voice was familiar. It was Katie's voice. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly and he said, "Katie, what's wrong?" Hearing Katie's voice, future Betty couldn't help but raise her face and look at Chen Tao. Katie said softly, I have been studying the food of your planet during this period. I don't know how well I made it, so I want you to come over and try it. Hearing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, he smiled and said, okay. Suddenly, Chen Tao felt his eyes go dark. Consciousness dissipated instantly. Everything was dark. What's going on? Chen Tao regained consciousness, but found himself in darkness. He came back to his senses and took a closer look. He saw Betty with blurred eyes. Betty was leaning on a pillow, her big eyes filled with blurry moisture, looking at Chen Tao. Betty's eyes glowed and she said, "What's wrong?" She was so emotional that her voice was trembling slightly. Hearing this, Chen Tao was stunned. What's going on? Chen Tao remembered that he was talking to future Betty just now, but what is going on now? Chen Tao said, "Betty, what's going on?" Betty's eyes were filled with doubts, and she said, "What's going on? You don't bully others anymore." Hearing this, Chen Tao blinked and looked around. Chen Tao discovered that the darkness around them was because they were wrapped in a cube. This cube seems to have been written by Chen Tao himself. And Chen Tao is now in bed with Betty. All this gave Chen Tao a strong sense of familiarity. Sensing something was wrong, Chen Tao quickly got off the bed and walked out of the dark cube. He took a look. Everything he saw made Chen Tao's pupils tremble. In front, Haiyu and Hangyu were sitting on the sofa. The two of them looked this way. What's going on? Haven't Hangyu and Haiyu already gone to Dragon City? Haiyu looked at Chen Tao and said, "What's wrong? You look surprised. Could it be that it's not going to work?" Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Haiyu. What happened? Wasn't Haiyu's database erased by future Betty? Shouldn't she only have Ziohei's memory? But now Haiyu, with her wise eyes, doesn't look like a child at all. Chen Tao looked at Hangyu and said, "Where is future Betty?" Future Betty, Hangyu looked confused. Are you talking about the future Red Dragon King Betty? What happened to her? Looking at Hangyu's puzzled look, Chen Tao felt a little pain in his brain. What on earth is going on? At this time, the space next to him fluctuated. A beautiful figure appeared in the room out of thin air. As soon as this beautiful figure appeared, it attracted everyone in the room. This person has long fiery red hair, a pair of ruby-like eyes, and a proud S-shaped figure. She is extremely beautiful. The pair of red dragon horns and red dragon wings add a bit of exotic charm to this beautiful woman. This woman is future Betty, and this is the queen-like future Betty, and she is in the same posture as when Chen Tao first saw her. Betty, seeing this, Hangyu's face changed. She hurried out, protecting Haiyu behind her. She looked at future Betty and said, "Betty, you'd better not do anything to Haiyu, you will regret it. This real timeline is different from your timeline. If you kill Haiyu, there will be no time machine, and without a time machine, your timeline will be gone." Chen Tao was stunned. He couldn't help but speak. What's going on? My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 300. It's so weird. Future Betty appeared in the form of a mature woman, but Hangyu was surprised when she saw future Betty, and even said that, as if future Betty came here for the first time. This scene was so weird that Chen Tao was very surprised. At this time, Chen Tao saw Haiyu lying on the sofa in a coma, and Hangyu looked at Haiyu in surprise. She wanted to speak, but her body couldn't move. Seeing this scene, Chen Tao naturally knew that it was done by future Betty. He looked at future Betty. Future Betty was also looking at him, and their eyes met. Future Betty's eyes were shining, and she smiled and said, "You seem surprised." For a moment, an idea popped up in Chen Tao's mind. Go back to the past. Yes, Chen Tao now feels like he has returned to the past. It's like using a time machine, but the problem is that there is no time machine now. Chen Tao subconsciously raised his wrist and looked at the time on his wrist. If it was because of the time machine, then Chen Tao's hand would definitely have a time break. Chen Tao took a look and found that on his wrist was still the symbol of infinity, infinity. Isn't it a time machine? Then what is going on? Future Betty saw that Chen Tao ignored her, and her eyes shone, and she said, Chen Tao. Hearing Future Betty's words, Chen Tao looked at Future Betty. If this is in the past, then this is also the first time Chen Tao and Future Betty meet. Then, everything has to start over again. Chen Tao took a deep breath, he looked at Future Betty, and was about to speak. Future Betty said, looking at your expression, are you also like me, inexplicably back here? Chen Tao was startled, he looked at Future Betty. What does Future Betty mean by the sentence? Could it be? Future Betty looked at Chen Tao's astonished eyes, Future Betty smiled, her body disappeared out of thin air, and reappeared. Chen Tao saw the Future Betty in the state of a loli. Future Betty looked at Chen Tao and said with a smile, do you understand now? After seeing this, Chen Tao completely understood. It was not Chen Tao who returned to this time period alone. Future Betty was also brought back. Chen Tao said, when was your memory when you returned here? Future Betty said, tomorrow morning, when I was lying in your arms, I heard your conversation with Katie in the Gene channel, and then I came back inexplicably. Inexplicably, that is to say, Future Betty didn't know what was going on. Chen Tao thought about it, and he said, look at your wrist to see if there is a time break. Future Betty said, I looked at it when I came back just now. There is no time break. It seems that we went back to the past not because of the time machine. Strange. Chen Tao frowned slightly. Chen Tao, who is she? Suddenly, a voice came from the side. Chen Tao came back to his senses. He looked beside him, and the black cube beside him had disappeared. Betty was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at this side with big eyes full of doubts, and her eyes were staring straight at the Future Betty. Future Betty looked at Betty, she smiled and said, I am you, you are me, I come from the future. Betty's eyes were shining, she frowned, and said, are you the Betty that Hangyu said? Hearing this, Future Betty crossed her arms and nodded slightly, yes. Betty pursed her thin lips and said, then why did you turn into a loli? Chen Tao walked over, raised his hand, and hugged Betty horizontally in his arms. Betty was slightly startled, she raised her little face and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked at Betty and smiled, there are many reasons, but none of them are important. The important thing is that she is you, you are her, and both of you are now my property. Betty was startled, and the ruby-like eyes under her eyelashes were full of doubts, what's going on, she didn't understand. Have you had contact with her before? Betty looked at Chen Tao with puzzled eyes. Betty didn't understand. In Betty's opinion, Future Betty should be from a different timeline. But now Betty found that Chen Tao and Future Betty seemed to have had contact. Chen Tao looked at Betty, and he explained gently, saying, she had come here before, and then the three of us spent some time together, and then I don't know what happened. Future Betty and I are back to the present. Betty's eyebrows stretched slightly, she slowly frowned, her eyes were full of doubts, she looked at Chen Tao, and then looked at Future Betty. Future Betty met Chen Tao's gaze. Chen Tao said to Future Betty, it seems that we have to find the reason. Future Betty crossed her arms and looked at Haiyu who was unconscious next to her, I guess there is something wrong with the timeline. Haiyu is the one who knows time best in the known universe. However, I just erased her database like last time. Even if we wait for her to wake up and ask her, we won't get an answer. Future Betty took back the time and looked at Chen Tao, in this case, we can only ask another person. Chen Tao said, Bai Yao. Future Betty nodded slightly, Bai Yao did research with us before. At that time, Bai Yao and Hao studied time together, and she also knows something about time. Chen Tao said, "Okay, I'll tell her right away." "No need." Suddenly, a voice came. Chen Tao looked back and saw Bai Yao, who was wearing white soft armor, standing there, next to a micro wormhole that was slowly closing. Chen Tao looked at Bai Yao and said, "Did you hear it all?" Bai Yao nodded slightly. She looked at Chen Tao and said, "I heard it, but I don't know the answer you and future Betty want to know. Although I have studied time, I am not proficient in understanding time. I don't know the problem you are causing now. Is there no way?" Chen Tao frowned slightly. "What should I do next?" Chen Tao looked at future Betty. Future Betty shook her head and said, "I am not as good at studying time as Bai Yao. If Bai Yao doesn't know, then I can't do anything." Chen Tao was silent for a while. He looked at Hongyu on the side. Hongyu still resumed action. She was looking at this side. Her expression was a little strange. Chen Tao looked at Hongyu and said, "The database about time in Hao's head has been cleared by Betty, and now the timeline has returned to normal. The technology you master is progressive and can help the current dragon civilization. You can take Hao and follow Biao back to Longren City." Hongyu was slightly startled, and she looked at the future Betty. "What about her?" Chen Tao smiled and said, "Just leave her to me, I can make her obedient." Hongyu looked at Chen Tao, "Although I don't know where you get your confidence from, but, okay." Hongyu looked at Biao, bowed slightly to Biao, and said, "White Dragon King." Biao nodded slightly and said, "Take Hao, I will take you back to Longren City." "Yeah." Hongyu hugged Hao and left with Biao. Looking at the slowly closing micro wormhole in front of him. "What should we do next?" Betty said. Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Betty and said, "Let's see first. If this is just an accident, then wait until tomorrow when time continues to pass and returns to normal, that's fine.